Creating AI that improves health, sponsored by Nuance. Thanks for joining us. I'm Casey Ross, National Technology Correspondent here at STAT. And I'm sure you know how this works by now. Before we get started, a few quick housekeeping. Creating AI. At the bottom of your screen, you should see several icons. Use the chat feature to chat amongst yourselves or to send a message directly to the STAT team. Please do not put your questions for us in the chat. If you do have a question that you'd like to ask us during the event, please use the Q&A feature to type your question and we'll try to answer it live. In the Q&A window, you should be able to see the questions that other attendees have asked and upvote the questions you'd most like us to answer. We'll be taking questions throughout, so please do not wait until the end to submit. This is what part of what makes these events engaging and a lot of fun. We want to hear from you, and thanks again for being here. Before we get started, I'd like to welcome Jared Pello, MD, the Chief Medical Information Officer at Nuance, for a sponsored introduction to today's event.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Pello. I'm an emergency medicine physician, and I am the Chief Clinical Product Officer at Nuance over the Dragon Ambient Experience product. Hi, everybody. At Nuance, our goal is to really turn the chair around for clinicians. And what we mean by that is that instead of clinicians being focused on the administrative task of documentation, that they can focus on their patients, what their patients came to be seen for. Now, we believe that machine learning and AI is what is going to help solve many of our ills in healthcare. And many of those ills, many of those obstacles in healthcare, just to name a few, are that there are increasing burdens on our time, increasing operational inefficiencies. We're asked to do more with less. There is an increase of burnout across all clinicians, not just physicians, but every clinician in the health system is feeling more and more burned out. And for myself, I had been practicing medicine back in 2013, been out of residency for a few years, working in a busy level 1 trauma center. And I grabbed my partner one day and I asked him, he was the happiest guy in our group. And I said, Andy, how do you stay so happy? How do you love your job? And he said, Jared, every day that I have off, I dread coming back to work. So I learned two things that day. Don't ask Andy for a pep talk because he's terrible at them. But number two, he said, those who seem happiest in healthcare are those who are working to make healthcare better. And one of the reasons I love talking to groups like this, and I'm really grateful to do this introduction, is because if you're here, if you're spending time watching this, then most likely you're one of those people working and wanting to make healthcare better. So we believe that we can solve that clinician burnout by allowing the clinician to get back to doing what they went into medicine for. And as a clinician myself, I know that I went into medicine. Well, actually, my thing was I love to serve others watching this, and I love science. I love medicine, and I felt really passionate about it. But when I found myself not spending time on that, it was painful. And that's what clinicians face every single day. And then I would say the other thing that really bothered me was I knew my patients weren't getting the experience they wanted. As a patient myself, when I go see my physician, if they got their head down, and I actually just went a couple of weeks ago, and he had his head down typing at the computer, not making eye contact with me, not able to watch my nonverbal communication. And at Nuance, we've developed something called Dragon Ambient Experience. And Dragon Ambient Experience is an AI tool that records the doctor and the patient talking, and then takes that recording, synthesizes it into clean, diarized transcripts. What that means is the doctor has a transcript, the patient has a transcript, anybody else in the room has transcripts. And then we use a large transformer model, neural network AI, and it does natural language generation, writing the note for the doctor. And this saves a doctor about 7 minutes on every patient visit, which has been truly remarkable to see. And because of that, we see a 70% decrease in feelings of burnout from clinicians. 9 out of 10 say they would recommend this product to others. 80% believe that the documentation is higher quality than they would do themselves. And patients, this is my favorite statistic, 80% say that their physicians are more focused on them, more conversational, and spending less time on computers. Now, we are really at the beginning of this journey. And why I think that this event is going to be so inspirational, so exciting for everybody to learn about, is that we're on the beginning of this AI journey. And I'm a little embarrassed to say that back when I started my startup in 2014, I was on a podcast and I was predicting the end of medical doctors. I believed that Watson was going to learn medicine and that we would merely be technicians. I no longer believe that. I believe that AI will extend both our intelligence and our compassion, allow us to connect with patients in new ways, and allow us to really heal. And we're at the beginning of this, and I think that what you're going to experience over the next hour as you listen to these experts is going to be really fascinating and hopefully give you all ideas on ways to tackle the problems ahead of us. So to end, I would just say thank you so much for taking time to come to this event. Thank you for being interested in making healthcare better. And I'll sign off and let the experts take over. Thank you.
Thank you again, Jared, for that introduction. And now I'd like to introduce today's panelists for the discussion. Amit Kaushal is an MD and clinical associate professor of medicine and adjunct professor of bioengineering at Stanford University. Judy Wawira Gachoya is an MD and assistant professor of interventional radiology and informatics in the Department of Radiology and Imaging Sciences at Emory University. And Jenna Wiens is a PhD and associate professor of computer science and engineering and associate director of the Artificial Intelligence Lab and co-director of Precision Health at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here. I wanted to sort of just preface the conversation, bouncing a little bit off of the intro remarks there. Sort of, I think by now we've all seen, a lot of proof of concept and even some prospective clinical studies that sort of bear out in a preclinical sense, sort of the potential here. We've seen AI models with really high AUCs and positive predictive values, but what we haven't seen is a ton of AI models that have been successfully implemented in care in a way that really makes a difference for patients. And that's kind of the gap we're going to be diving into today to talk more about. And I wanted to start with you, Jenna. When it comes to implementing an AI model within a health system, how do we overcome some of those big challenges? The challenge of translating a model into care and maybe to dealing with models whose performance may deteriorate over time.
Yeah, so great questions. I'll start with the second part of your question first, which is how to deal with model performance degrading over time. So in general, we expect model performance will get worse over time. And Casey, you've shown this in your work with the folks at MIT, where a sepsis model applied to the mimic data did gradually worse over the course of a decade. And this happens because patient populations shift, clinical workflows shift, and even things like how diagnoses are coded can shift. And all of these changes can impact model performance. But what do we do about it? There are a couple of things. So one, we can make sure that we validate the model in as many different settings as possible. So we did this recently in our own work, where we developed a patient deterioration index here at Michigan, and then we validated it in 12 different hospitals. And the idea was to validate across different regions of the US in different patient populations, so that we could be prepared if there's any sort of shifts in the data. I'd say the second thing to think about is your model input. So what are you putting into your model? If you think carefully about these and how they could be affected by shifts, you can be more prepared for those shifts. So if you know that your model is going to take as input diagnostic codes and the way that you code those change over time, you can either have checks that look for like big shifts in the data and be prepared, or you can focus on model inputs where there's a known physiological mechanism. Things like vital sign measurements that might be less likely to change. In terms of the first part of your question, how do we ensure clinical utility or improve clinical utility? And I would encourage researchers in this setting to think about that problem from the very beginning. I think oftentimes as computer scientists, especially, we get caught up in the machine learning aspects of the problem. And what I like to do whenever I start a new collaboration with a clinician is ask them a simple question, which is, if machine learning were magic, and it's not, but if it were, and I could give you a perfect model tomorrow, so perfect accuracy, perfect positive predictive value, what would you do with it? And asking that simple question up front often has serious repercussions in terms of even how we think about the problem. Are we asking the right problem that will actually maximize clinical impact?
Thanks, Jenna. Just to add to everything Jenna said, my own background, I spend half my time seeing patients, and the other half, I'm a computer scientist by training. So I straddle both of these worlds. Like I see all those of us who got into this field 10, 15 years ago thought that getting these models to work was going to be the hard part, right? Like figuring, but with all the recent advances in machine learning, deep learning, large data sets, it turns out that the hard part is actually getting them to be useful. So there's been a ton of advances on the computational side, but medicine still looks not too different from when I was in medical school and residency. I suspect that that's a lot of what we'll talk about today. But to take a totally different approach to dealing with model deterioration. Casey, I can take your question and say, you asked, how do we deal with a model deteriorating over time with deteriorating performance? If I replace that with pretend you're in a company and you have an employee, and how do you deal with an employee whose performance deteriorates over time, right? An employee who shows up and on day one does what he or she said he was going to do really well, but a year in or 2 years in, isn't quite doing the job. Well, there are a few things you need, right? You need a system in place to actually measure and identify that this employee is not doing well. Then you need to figure out, well, why is this employee not doing well? There's a bunch of different reasons the employee might not be doing well. Maybe your definition of what doing well has changed, or maybe the problem itself has gotten harder. And then how consequential is it, right? Is this like a catastrophic error that's taking place, or something that we can fix over time? And finally, what are the ways that we can get in there? And what are the types of things that might actually fix this problem? For an employee, do they need to be retrained? Does your model need to be retrained? The similar types of things. And I think the big takeaway from all this is everybody who has manager in their title spends a long time thinking about these problems when it comes to employees. And it's going to be at this stage, that's the stage that we're at with AI in healthcare. It's not a point and click deployment with a couple of check-ins. There's going to need to be an infrastructure analogous to the people management to manage and check in on and make sure things are working over time as we think they should.
Judy, I wanted to bring you in. As it turns out, AI models seem to detect things like the race of a patient on a medical image, as demonstrated in one of your studies, that a physician cannot necessarily see, at least not within the confines of the image. What does that mean for safety and fairness? Walk us through the implications. What do we need to be aware of there?
Yeah, thanks for the invitation to the panel and for that question. So when people hear that you're evaluating models for, bias, sometimes it comes with a little bit of shame, like, oh, you're doing something wrong. And I would like to at least debunk that that's not the work that we're doing. And we just want to figure out and we come into this sort of challenge that we know that the black box nature of AI models makes it very difficult to understand why the models come to a specific prediction. And, there is also discourse that maybe that we don't need to really understand the why, like explanations are a false target, that what we need to change is understand how or when the models fail. And so that's another component to, the concept of distribution shift. So in terms of our work, I would say maybe two things for people to remember. One is we've seen quite a lot of models being built on just medical imaging that are actually performing very well. And even more encouraging is that they are performing well for minority patients. There's a breast image model called Mirai from MGH that, it shows that it's much better than what we clinically use at present to say what's the 3 and 5 year breast cancer risk of breast cancer. A second one is this model done by Ziad and Emma, which shows, hey, if you listen to the patient and you just make an image-based model, you can tell what their osteoarthritis, which just means narrowing of your knee joint, how severe that is. And in fact, they go one step further and say, look, now you're eligible for surgery and you can actually make a difference. So if this model, and again, that model comes back and says, hey, we really, really narrow the gap for minorities. So if we're having this good success, but at the same time, we're saying these models are pretty good at identifying the race of some signal that's correlating to the self-reported race. Are they good because they're able to tell the disease consistently for everyone? Or are they using a proxy because everyone on this panel and in the audience knows that models love confounders and they pick up on the smallest, the tiniest patterns that we never ever expect. And so our work one is to figure out what's the significance of this race contribution to the model prediction? And then on the other hand is how do we harness this ability to actually build better predictive models that work for everyone else?
I wanted to jump in with a question from a viewer, because I think it's an interesting one, and I think it's an important one for translation. How do you help clinicians understand that AI is probabilistic and that the yes/no they see is based on someone's decision on the proper threshold to make, that a likely determination that it doesn't mean someone definitely has or does not have X condition or need to be tested for Y? Without this understanding, doesn't it have the potential to do more harm than good? And how do you bring about that understanding in clinicians? I'll throw that out and whoever wants to jump in on it.
So I'm happy to take that one because we're working through this right now. We have a project where we have a model that predicts infections with C. diff. So C. diff is a type of bug that is a leading cause of healthcare-associated infections at many institutions. And at this point, we have a good understanding of the disease. We have tools that can help reduce the spread of the disease, but the tools require resources that we can't implement on a hospital-wide basis. So the idea is let's use the model to target those interventions. And we started this project about 10 years ago. And at the very beginning, toyed around with the idea of, well, what if we just showed the risk scores to clinicians, right? So we have a risk score for every patient in the hospital today. They could look at, well, what's the probability of a patient acquiring an infection? And we ultimately didn't go that route because it's not clear what a clinician would do with that, right? What does 0.9 probability mean? And even if I threshold it, what does that mean? So instead, we really thought through the clinical workflow. What are aspects of the clinical workflow where we could use the model? So what are some infection prevention strategies that we would like to do anyways, but just don't know how to target them? Things like washing your hands with soap and water, because that kills the C. diff spores. Things like ordering an allergy consult to make sure that you're on the right type of antibiotics. So we have worked really, really closely with many stakeholders, so infectious disease physicians, antimicrobial stewardship experts, infection prevention teams, nursing, even clerks, to understand the workflows and how we could integrate a model so it's almost seamless. And it's still going to require an alert, but the idea is that it will minimize the impact on the clinical workflow, because you can have a perfect model, but if the physician doesn't follow the protocol, doesn't follow the intervention because of a breakdown in the workflow, it doesn't matter. Right? The model's not going to have the impact that you want it to have. So having those conversations early on and engaging all of the different stakeholders, not just physicians, but thinking even from a patient perspective, how are they going to deal with this, the output of this model, I think is really important.
Thanks, Jenna.
Sorry, go ahead, Emma.
Go, Judy.
So my addition to this is two things. One is this value-based design when it comes to AI models. And if you think, fine, the AI that we build is narrow, but also the end user is also a narrow target, not just because of so people in radiology and may build something that detects wrist fractures, but then it doesn't really consider who orders the test and who the patient is. So for example, we see quite a lot of triage algorithms, in radiology, and these are trying to say, look, this patient has a pulmonary embolus, something that's going to kill the patient. You can imagine a to-do list, but you have a smart model that tells you, maybe why don't you take care of this to-do list, like buy your tea today because you will not have tea when you get home, or something like that. And so we see quite a lot of these triage algorithms. But let's think about the values of the people who work in this system. One, you could be in an academic place that you have to teach the residents who need to see those cases that are being tried, so that they are able to learn about the disease condition that the model is sort of triaging those cases to maybe someone who's reading. So we see a change even in how we work as radiologists to accommodate some of these AI changes, so that you have one person who's working with residents and another one who's just trying to keep the service going. Think about the other patient who's in the ER, who maybe has a normal imaging, normal X-ray, but the model ranked this case as lower priority. But maybe this image was ordered as a first step of a follow-up test that's going to be positive. So, I saw this patient and I thought, well, is it the chest or the abdomen? I started off with chest imaging, but I will order another set of imaging. So if I push that image lower to the queue, then we impact a delay in those patients. Or other patients who may need to use the ER, but if we're only taking care of the sick patients and not letting the other patients who can go home early because we're changing how their studies are interpreted, then they're spending more time and occupying beds that are necessary for other patients. So we have to elucidate what values drive us for each case, and those values change. I like to give the example that if I'm late to work, my biggest value is speed. But if your child is in the car, probably the biggest value at that point is safety. And how do we dynamically design and build this model so that they can understand the values of the end users who build them?
And I'll just to the questioner, with all respect, I disagree with the premise of this question. I think us physicians, we have a lot of quirks, but reasoning under uncertainty is something we do on a daily basis, right? We can have two tests suggesting infection, but something else says, hey, maybe this is an autoimmune or cancer. That's really what's driving what's going on. How do we manage it? What's the next step? How do we go forward? So very rarely in our clinical practice do we just expect a yes, no, and follow it blindly. So I think that you should think of the physician's ability to reason under uncertainty as a strength in any collaboration and play to that strength, as opposed to something that's holding you back.
And Hamid, I wanted to stay with you for a second. One of the questions that always sort of comes up when we're talking about AI and its robustness and fairness and its durability over time is the quality of the data that's initially sort of fed into it. And you did a study a couple of years ago sort of showing that that data was predominantly coming from 3 specific locales, Massachusetts, New York, and California. Well, how's it going to perform for people like me in Ohio or folks in Mississippi or elsewhere or other geographies where we would try to apply a model? Right now, we're hearing, I think all of us who are in this space, a lot about the potential of federated learning, these kind of distributed approaches where you can share the insights from data without sharing the underlying data. I wanted to ask you about whether we're actually seeing any of that meaningfully happen yet, or what we need to do at this point to improve the flow of diverse data sets for better AI.
Yeah, that's a great question, one that we spend a lot of time thinking about over here. To start from the high level, we've known for a long time, even before AI and machine learning has really come into vogue, that for an algorithm or a statistical method to work well, we want the population that it's trained on to roughly match the population that it's going to be used on. And so in this case of the population, many folks who are in AI and machine learning envision, at the very least, national use of these models. Then how do we get data, training data that comes from all over the country? And it's hard. It's much, and not for technical reasons. These are operational it's very hard to go to 1,000 hospitals all over the country and license 10 CT scans to train your tumor detection algorithms. Much easier to go to 3 hospitals and license 1,000 scans each. So there are real structural barriers to attacking this problem. I think the approach you're talking about, federated learning, is very elegant. When we train models, normally there's a central computer or now in the cloud these days, but a module that's going to run the training, and all the data needs to get to that central place for training. Moving data around in healthcare is hard for non-technical reasons, privacy and security, things like that. And so federated learning takes the opposite approach. It says, rather than move the data to where the model training is happening, can we move the model training to where each of these data sets are? And it works. It works almost as well as to training in a central place. But in practice, we aren't seeing, or we haven't really seen large-scale adoption. It's elegant. And elegance in healthcare is both a virtue and a hindrance, right? That it requires a bit of orchestration and coordination and buy-in from a lot of willing parties to get this done. And in the last few years, I think the way we're trying to tackle this problem, for better or for worse, is looking at this field of large language models and more broadly foundation models that has emerged, which is, can one big actor or a couple of big actors generate huge models that can do a lot of the initial machine learning work, and then people who want to deploy at their own institution can then do domain adaptation or kind of do those finishing touches to make sure that model works for the problem at hand. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming years how this whole field evolves, but it's still very much an open challenge.
Another question I wanted to toss in from a viewer, it's actually more of a statement, but one you can react to. It sounds like the uptake of AI will be more accepted by academic settings and within larger hospital systems than in private practice setting, where the vast majority of medicine is practiced. Do you agree with that? What are your thoughts about sort of the universe of users and where you expect AI, these kinds of models, to be impactful and useful?
So I'm optimistic. I think that these approaches will scale to other institutions. I think right now, it's mostly the large academic medical centers that have the resources to develop these models, validate these models, and think carefully about the workflows. But I also think that the adoption of AI in health will be somewhat like the adoption of the electronic health record. It's going to be really slow at first. It's going to be very bumpy, but we'll get there. And to this end, I think that the EHR vendors can actually be doing a lot in terms of helping accelerate model development across institutions, helping with model validation. But ultimately, how you integrate the model and how you use the model, so how you use AI, is going to come down to each clinical practice, sometimes even to each unit within a hospital, because you have to consider those clinical workflows. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, just to add, I think proof of concept AI will be largely in the academic setting. You know, when I want to get something new off the ground, I know whose doors to knock on in my institution, and who owes me a couple of favors and who can help me get the data and do those kinds of things. AI that solves a real problem, I think everybody in the community, everybody who's practicing medicine, is looking for real problems to be solved, whether it's their patients' problems, you know, how do we get better outcomes, whether it's efficiency problems, whether it's minimizing documentation. And so I think those are the solutions that we're waiting for. And this cohort of people who are in the field right now and working the next 5-7 years are moving from how do we go from these proof of concepts to actually solving doctors and patients and others in the healthcare ecosystem's problems. When we see that, you know, we'll see plenty of adoption.
Another question I'm going to stop ignoring now because it's been asked a couple of times.
Can I at least react once?
Oh yeah, please go ahead, Judy. Yeah.
So I work in radiology where over 70% of the work is done in private practice. But you also have to understand what else is going on in the society to understand who and how models will be evolved. What we are seeing, even for academic centers, that the future is not going to be one strict academia or private practice. We're seeing these hybrid models. A big hospital buy small community hospitals, so they have a hybrid of both. And that will be a way that these AI models, you know, are used in both places. But the second thing that we've seen accelerate is the, you know, venture capitalist purchase of groups, you know, of radiology groups. And those VCs are still the same people who are funding AI, you know, models, and we're starting to have even some of those AI developers come in-house. And so at least in radiology, I do anticipate to see a bigger uptake of AI models in private practice before, you know, academia, just because of, if you look at what are the market forces that are changing and the need to sort of read faster, read more, and with less people, those will be the big market changes that accelerate adoption in the private practice.
A couple of viewers have asked, what are examples of some successful AI models that you've seen make a difference in clinical settings? If each of you sort of wants to jump in there and talk about an example, just to make this a little bit more practical and concrete for people about what types of models are being used and making a difference.
Sure, I can jump in with one that was done earlier this year, not from my institution, so no bias here. But Kaiser in Northern California had a very nice demonstration of a system for detecting imminent patient deterioration in the inpatient setting, validated across over a dozen hospitals in their system. Very nice, because I think the actual modeling work for the paper was published maybe 5 or 6 years ago. We can take data and develop a model to predict inpatient deterioration. But they rolled it out in stage across each of their various hospitals, thinking through, and Jenna, you mentioned this so many times, thinking through the workflow of how would something like this actually be used to improve patient outcomes. And the workflow they came up with, which is common now to a lot of people going in the clinical setting, is we need a human in the loop, and in this case, multiple humans in the loop. So their model would alert to a patient who had impending deterioration. That alert would be second or overread by a nurse who they resource this appropriately to actually field those alerts. And if the human and the algorithm both believe that this was an impending case of deterioration, then the physician at the point of care was alerted, and they showed meaningful improvement in outcomes. I think that half computational, half getting in the weeds of how will this actually fit in healthcare is a great example of what success will look like going forward.
Yeah, another example that was just highlighted last week. So Suchi Saria's group at Johns Hopkins and Vision Health published work in Nature Medicine on their sepsis model that showed a decrease in the duration or the time to receipt of antibiotics and a decrease in mortality as a result. So I think that's a great concrete example of how AI can help.
I'll also say success from a different perspective, financial, right? The first models to be paid for by CMS are looking at intracranial hemorrhage and rather stroke triage. And we see that's a model that has figured out how to work with payers, how to get reimbursement for the hospitals, which we know will drive quite a lot of the adoption once people can get paid for using the model. But from a clinician perspective, I think some of the most interesting models for me have been the ones being used in the cardiac space to do image reconstructions, doing a task that's very, very, like burdensome for the doctor. And here, as most people now get a CT chest to when you present with chest pain, those images require very precise reconstructions and measurements. And we're seeing pretty good performance of those models and expansion to develop like a cardiac risk. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how these models change healthcare, whether they cause it overutilization or underutilization, and which patients benefit to them most.
I wanted to pull out one question from a couple of the answers that you've all given, and it has to do with sort of the type of model and where the model was developed. We see like Suchi Saria's model, the deterioration model. Those are all models that are provided by EHR vendors, and EHR vendors models. Do they generalize? Are they going to be effective in different settings? Do we need to have a model that's more localized? Is it more likely that we're going to have a homegrown model be more successful and efficacious than an off-the-shelf sort of model that might be easier to implement? Can you sort of talk about the push and pull there and where you think that you're most likely to see effective AI come from?
I'll go first. So the homegrown models, as a group that actually builds a lot of models, is very tricky. We as physicians are terrible business people. And I mean, seriously, I do think that, it's just so difficult to really like think about the business of software development. And we see this in terms of the electronic medical record adoption, right? Most of the homegrown solutions are now gone. You either have the big players, the Epics and the Sanas. And other players. I do not own any shares in any of those, so I don't have a preference. But what is concerning to me about the EHR homegrown models is that one of the barriers of deploying AI is getting into a health system. And this is why you're seeing the platforms, really accelerate, because you want to get into the healthcare system. It takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of IT and legal paperwork. And so if you already deploy an EMR X in your system, and I can just push models to you, then that's, we're going to see a lot of that. The problem with that is that these models, most of them are not labeled decision support. And the decision support models do not necessarily need to go through FDA. And so we honestly do not know if they work for everyone. You just see something that pops up on your EMR one day and says this patient is decompensating. There's no history, there's no engagement, there's no way to report how a model doesn't work. And so this, while it's a slippery slope, it's probably the lowest hanging fruit to help us do validation. And we've seen some of these papers, I think, looking at the sepsis model in Epic that shows it doesn't, it didn't work as expected. And so that's what I think, that these people are already in the healthcare system, but we still don't have access. And maybe that's the role of people in academia to validate some of these models.
Yeah, I think.
Another question. Go ahead, Amit.
Oh, well, just briefly, no doubt when a lot of us who build AI-based models, we're separated both in time and in space from when that data was generated, right? That data was generated for some other purpose, a clinical purpose, and months or years later, fun exercise to go through AI papers in healthcare and see the date they were published and the date that the data came from. And it's often years apart, right? Because we're asking for this data way after the fact. And then often from our own institution and sometimes from other places. And then as Judy said, to close the loop and get it back to actually influence and action also takes a long time. And so EHR companies and companies more broadly who are already in the operational workflow, who are capturing the data as it's being generated, are fundamentally in a better position to do something with that data. Now, what they will do with it, I think, it remains to be seen.
Yeah, so just building off of that, I agree that the EHR vendors are already in an easier starting point from infrastructure perspective and access to the data. But as someone in a group where we have built a lot of models, I can tell you it's far more difficult to build a model when you don't have a clinical collaborator at the hospital where you're working with the data. Because there's so many nuances to clinical data, EHR data, clinical workflows. We're constantly asking our clinical collaborators questions. So if we just got a dump of data from 100 different hospitals, it would be really challenging to sort through all of those nuances and make sure that we had the best model for each institution rather than just a model, which I think is where we're at right now, or at least the EHR vendors are at right now.
Yeah. See, but you could output something. You care because you want to output the right thing, right? But someone with such a dump of data could put out a result. And I think that's the tension.
And
right?
they do.
And so how do we bring about more effective regulation in that regard when we can't, regulate, necessarily the intent? How do you regulate the output there? How do we build a better system that isn't just like we're looking at a couple of studies and saying, yep, it's doing what you say it's going to do, as opposed to really looking at, is it going to be robust over time? Is it going to be fair to broad groups of people? I mean, how do we need to change that system to get at those questions? Judy, if you want to start there.
So regulation, and thankfully I learned this a few years ago because of radiology has gone through a lot of regulation, is very difficult. If we're going to have laws, if you think about how much advocacy and campaigning goes on Capitol Hill to pass, a law or regulation, it's difficult. So what we need is governance structures, right? And governance means, in Amit's case, saying, if we have this EHR vendor who's selling us models, what's going to be our internal process to make sure that these applications work, and how are they going to be distributed? And how do we get the voice of the clinicians, and not just the administrator who wants to discharge as many patients as you can? And so these governance structures, I think, are evolving. We don't know what's going to be what. And, like, for example, now this year in Europe, we have an autonomous AI for chest x-rays called Oxyper. And if the patient has a question about a study that was completely interpreted without any human oversight, should they call me or call the company that read the study? There are things that we just haven't thought about. And if we said, oh, let's write a law today, it's just not going to be sufficient. So I believe that we'll need to have governance structures. We need to think about continuous model monitoring, and also these academic, industry partnerships that overcome these barriers of the double black box. I don't know, there's the black box of using this when you use the deep learning models, but then there's another black box because you don't want to share your code or anything else because you're concerned that I'm going to steal your work, or, that it's intellectual property. And so till we figure out those sort of forms of governance that are necessary. I think trying to accelerate laws will change a few laws, and it's still going to take a lot of time and even disincentivize change, in my opinion. For example, if every time you update your code, you have to go through the FDA approval process, I'm not going to update my code, because it's too burdensome.
Yeah, I think that last issue you raised, Judy, is particularly interesting, that one of the strengths of a robust AI system for a variety of use cases that we've touched upon is its ability to adapt over time, right? To with new data coming in, or to be able to kind of react as trends change. But how does an approval process or a regulatory process look like for that? It's not like a drug, right? Where you have a compound and you do a trial and you show some efficacy, and then there's a little bit of phase 4 back end monitoring over the life of the drug. Like, these things are by design going to change a lot after they're released. So a very challenging space.
And I know I sound like a broken record, but I think you really have to think about the clinical workflow and rigorously evaluate at your institution, right? Just because a model has an AUROC of 0.8 doesn't mean, and let's say it even has a 0.8 AURC at your institution, doesn't mean it's going to have the impact that you expect it will have. So that's something that, like Judy said, continuously monitoring not just the model, but the downstream consequences and impact of that model is so important.
Mm-hmm. Are we equipped to do that now, do you think? I mean, is that, is there, the universe of studies, to my eye, that are being done are widely variable between institutions, ranging from like a prospective quality improvement implementation to just your kind of pre and post study, looking before and after. What would you say about that?
Yeah, so are we equipped depends on who we is. I think that, like Judy said, we're still learning as we go with respect to even just governance. So the University of Michigan now has a clinical intelligence committee composed of experts and stakeholders that review models before they're prospectively validated, before resources are poured into prospective validation, before they even think about impacting clinical care. And I think that's the right, a step in the right direction, but we certainly haven't figured it all out yet.
I wanted to get to another question from a viewer. In the current world of clinical AI, this person writes, we have a different algorithm for each condition, an algorithm to predict sepsis, another algorithm to predict a heart attack. Patients, however, don't present with a diagnosis. They present with symptoms that are frequently nonspecific. So how do we bridge that gap?
I think there's, AI is very broad, right? There are many use cases, and the use case that you're asking about is this field of diagnostic AI, right? To say, and in your case, you're asking specifically about symptoms, but it could be subjective data like symptoms, objective data like vital signs and chest x-rays, and try to figure out what is going on. I think there's a lot of work being done in that space, in addition to the kind of management kind of space. So once we know a patient has something, where do we go from there? So I think people are active.
And I'm also really excited about reinforcement learning in healthcare. So there's, to date, the vast majority of work has been focused on supervised learning, where we're trying to, predict an outcome or make a diagnosis. When you shift things to start thinking about reinforcement learning, you now shift the problem to what's the right action, right? So what's the right lab test to order? What's the right treatment? What's the right medication to order? And I think that's really exciting going forward.
And I wanted to spend the last few minutes, just talking about, sort of the challenges that are sort of up next, but I guess more more directly sort of your reasons for optimism at this point, because we're all sort of working in this because we believe that this can make a difference, that it can improve care, that AI, if applied correctly, can really improve outcomes and extend physician capabilities in a significant way. So I wanted to ask each of you, what makes you optimistic? What do you foresee coming next that can really improve healthcare? Maybe Judy, if you wanted to start there.
So personally, in terms of direct applications of AI, I'm excited about this concept of opportunistic screening, where AI is able to look through, for example, if you get a CT scan of your chest, we capture just the top part of your abdomen, and that can tell us a lot about your liver health. But when a radiologist is interpreting it, they focus more on disease, and so could we start to figure out these hidden signals and hidden biomarkers in medical imaging and what they mean in terms of outcomes? So could we start to get better risk profiles for patients who are getting elective surgery? Could we start to understand better cardiac risk? And so I believe, which is an area where I see like imaging and AI going into population health, is something that is not done today and is something that could easily add value, as quite a lot of patients get imaging every time they come into the healthcare system. The other bigger society issue that I'm excited about is that I feel like the hype is dying. The messages are changing from let's replace doctors, let's replace radio, all that. And it's really, we're starting to see more validation, like big papers are coming out on telling us really, how does this stuff works? And, I'm excited about that, because that's going to encourage us to publish when things don't work. Hopefully there's a journal that's going to start accepting this type of papers, and we're going to like really get a true knowledge of how we excel, we impact healthcare using these systems by sort of pursuing these human-machine partnerships and collaborations, and figuring out when AI fails, just beyond like the AUCs, just like Jana's talked about. So I'm excited about those two things.
And Amit, do you want to go next?
Sure, I'll jump in. I think a couple of answers. I think part of me is like, how can we not be optimistic? If you told someone in 2003 or 2008 that, hey, in 2022, we're going to have models that, and sufficiently large data sets that can predict all kinds of stuff, and our challenges are going to be to make sure that they work equally across different subpopulations, and how do we deploy these effectively, and how do we change clinical workflows? But they're all downstream or kind of on either end of the technical modeling portion. You're like, 2022 or 2072? Like, wait, this has come so much faster than we all anticipated. And this is all the challenges we're dealing with now are very natural in the growth and evolution of a new technology, and how do we integrate it to to actually move the needle on real problems that matter. So I think that's one. And the other answer may be a little corny, but I train undergraduates and graduate students. I feel I have to say it's really the people in the field right now. In 2022, if you're a domain expert and you have a strong background in AI and machine learning, there are far less painful ways to make a living than tackling the beast of healthcare. But the people that we have, especially with some of the hype that's died down now, are here because they're mission driven, they want to solve meaningful problems, and they know it's not going to be easy, and they know it's going to involve things like thinking about workflows and how do we integrate and how do we talk with non-technical people and physicians. And that I think is kind of new. A few years ago, it was really focused on the technical capabilities, but we're past that, and the people who are here are committed to that. So I'm very optimistic about that.
And I'm just going to double down on the people. That's also what gives me a lot of hope. Machine Learning for Healthcare, our big annual conference, is happening in a couple of days, and they just released all the research papers online yesterday, and so many of them are by up and coming PhD students in the field. And to see that that work and that enthusiasm gives me a lot of hope.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for taking the time to talk today. And I would also echo those comments on machine learning for healthcare. It's really a great conference. I would encourage anybody who's watching this to watch that, because it's just filled with really great people and thinkers and ideas. And I haven't really come across an event quite like that in machine learning in healthcare. So do check in for that. I have to end with an apology to all of you for not getting to all the great questions that you put in the Q&A. I wish we could have gotten to more, but I want to thank especially Amit, Judy, and Jenna for joining me today, for answering these really great questions from the audience. Thanks to our event sponsor, Nuance, and to all of you out there for taking the time to join us. Please be sure to check out STAT's next virtual event, Biomarkers, the Foundation of Personalized Oncology. That's going to be on August 17th. My colleague Angus Chen will be sitting down with a panel of experts to discuss recent innovations in cancer biomarkers. For more information about that program and how to register, that can all be found on our website. Thank you again to everybody. Stay safe and be well.
Thank you.